morning of the hearing, my aunt rolled her eyes the second she saw me walk through the courthouse doors. Not subtle, not even pretending to hide it. She turned to my uncle and said something behind her hand, and they both laughed the way people laugh when they think they've already won. I was 28 years old, standing in a charcoal suit my grandmother bought me 3 weeks before she died, and the people suing me for her entire estate were the same people who'd skipped my high school graduation because they had a thing in Aspen. My name is Holden Mariner. My grandmother's name was Rosalie. And until the day they read her will, my mother's side of the family pretended I didn't exist. I want to start at the beginning because if I don't, none of what happened in that courtroom will land right. I was 6 years old when my mother dropped me off at my grandmother's house in Beaufort, South Carolina. She told me she was running to the pharmacy. She left a duffel bag on the porch with 3 pairs of underwear, a stuffed elephant missing 1 ear, and a sandwich wrapped in a napkin that already had a grease stain bleeding through. I sat on that porch swing for 4 hours before my grandmother realized something was wrong. My mother didn't come back that day. She didn't come back the next day either. She called 11 months later from a hotel in San Diego asking if Rosalie could wire her some money for a deposit on a new start. That's the woman who would, 22 years later, sit in a courtroom and accuse me of manipulating a dying old woman into changing her will. My grandmother raised me in a yellow clapboard house 2 blocks from the water. She had a vegetable garden in the back and a porch with 2 rocking chairs that creaked in a way I can still hear if I close my eyes. She was a retired insurance executive, not flashy, but quietly, very, very wealthy. I didn't know that when I was a kid. I just knew she made grits the right way and that she came to every single one of my baseball games, even the away ones, even the ones in the rain. My grandfather had passed before I was born, so it was just the 2 of us. And for a long time, that felt like the whole world. My mother had 2 siblings, my aunt Callista and my uncle Roderick, both older. Both already adults with their own lives when I showed up on Rosalie's porch, both furious that their mother was now playing house with the child their wayward sister had abandoned. They never said it to my face when I was little, but I could feel it. The way Callista would inspect me when she visited at Christmas, her eyes scanning my clothes, my hair, the way I held my fork, the way Roderick would ask, in that voice adults use when they want a kid to know they're being judged, "And what does your mother do these days, Holden? Still in California?" I was 8. I didn't know what my mother did. I knew she sent a card on my birthday sometimes. I knew she called on Christmas Eve once, drunk, and told my grandmother she was going to come get me for real this time. I knew she didn't. My grandmother never said a bad word about her. Not once. She'd hang up the phone with my mother and just stand there at the kitchen counter for a minute, holding the edge with both hands, breathing. Then she'd turn around and ask me if I wanted to help her shell peas. I went to college at Clemson on a partial scholarship. My grandmother paid the rest, though I didn't know how much that was until much later. I studied civil engineering, got a job in Charleston designing stormwater systems for coastal towns. Nothing glamorous. I liked the math. I liked that when I did my job right, somebody's grandmother in a flood zone slept better at night. I drove back to Beaufort every other weekend. My grandmother and I had a standing Sunday breakfast. Pancakes, coffee, the newspaper spread across the kitchen table while she read me the obituaries in a tone that was both reverent and gossipy. "Oh, Holden, look, Theodora Bellwether. She used to steal my mother's hydrangea cuttings. Took her 91 years to get caught. When she got sick, I moved back. It was pancreatic. They caught it late, which is how they usually catch it. The doctor was a younger woman named Dr. Ifioma Akampong, and she was kind in the way doctors are when they know they're not going to be able to save somebody. She told me in the hallway outside my grandmother's room that we were looking at months, not years, that I should help her get her affairs in order. I went home that night and sat in the rocking chair my grandfather had built, and I cried until my ribs hurt. My grandmother handled it better than I did. She always handled everything better than everybody else. The next morning, she called her attorney, a man named Bertram Caspian, who'd been her lawyer for 36 years. He came to the house. They sat in the front room with the door closed for 2 hours. When he left, he squeezed my shoulder and said, "Your grandmother is a remarkable woman." I already knew that. Callista and Roderick showed up that weekend. They'd heard. I don't know who told them. Probably one of the church ladies. Beaufort is small. Callista cried the kind of cry that's mostly for the audience. She kept hugging my grandmother and saying things like, "Mama, we should have visited more. We should have called more." And my grandmother, who was on morphine for the pain by then, looked at her over Callista's shoulder and gave me a look I'll never forget. It was the same look she used to give me when a telemarketer called during dinner. Roderick brought his wife, a woman named Suzette, who collected ceramic frogs and laughed at things that weren't jokes. He spent most of the visit walking around the house and looking at things. The grandfather clock, the painting in the dining room, the silver tea set in the cabinet. He didn't think I noticed. I noticed. My mother didn't come. She sent a card. The card said, "Mama, I'm praying for you. Hope you're comfortable. Adelaide." That was it. No phone number. No address. No mention of me, of course. My grandmother kept that card on her nightstand. I asked her once near the end why she didn't throw it away. She said, "Because she's still my daughter, Holden. I gave birth to her. I just didn't end up raising her." She said it without bitterness. I didn't understand it then. I'm not sure I understand it now. She died on a Tuesday in October. The pecans were just starting to drop in the side yard. I was holding her hand. Dr. Akimpong was there. My grandmother's last words to me were, "Holden, sweetheart, make sure you eat something today." Then she closed her eyes. The funeral was that Saturday. Callista and Roderick flew in. My mother did not. Callista wore black Chanel and oversized sunglasses she didn't take off, even inside the church. She gave the eulogy. She talked about her childhood with Rosalie like she'd been there for it, like she hadn't spent the last 20 years calling once every Mother's Day and forgetting Christmas entirely. I sat in the front pew and stared at my hands. 3 days later, Bertram Caspian read the will. We met in his office on Bay Street. Dark wood paneling. A grandfather clock that ticked too loud. Callista wore a navy blazer. Roderick wore a tie that didn't match his shirt. My mother had flown in by then. First time I'd seen her in 9 years. She'd put on weight. Her hair was dyed a shade of red that didn't occur in nature. She didn't hug me. She nodded at me like I was a colleague she half recognized from a conference. Bertram cleared his throat and started reading. The house in Beaufort went to me. The investment portfolio went to me. The savings, the bonds, the life insurance, the small commercial building on Carteret Street that Rosalie had owned since 1987 and rented out to a coffee shop, all of it, to me. To Callista, my grandmother left her mother's pearl necklace and a handwritten note. To Roderick, a set of antique fishing rods and a handwritten note. To my mother, the family Bible and a handwritten note. Total estate, after taxes and probate, somewhere north of $4 million. The room got very quiet. Callista was the first to speak. She said, "I'm sorry, Bertram. There must be some mistake." Bertram said, "There's no mistake, Callista." Roderick said, "When was this will drafted?" Bertram looked at him over his reading glasses. 8 years ago, with minor updates approved by your mother last spring." My mother said nothing. She was looking at me the way a person looks at a stranger who just took their parking spot. Callista said, "We're going to need to talk about this." I said, "Talk about what?" She turned to me and smiled the way you smile at a dog that's blocking your path. "Holden, sweetie, you can't possibly think this is what Mama really wanted." I said, "It's what she signed." Roderick said, "She was sick, Holden. She was on heavy medication. She wasn't herself." I said, "She drafted this 8 years ago. She wasn't sick 8 years ago." My mother finally spoke. She said, "We'll see what a judge says." That was the first time I understood that I was about to be in a fight. They sued me 6 weeks later. Undue influence. They claimed I'd manipulated my grandmother, that I'd isolated her from her real family, that I'd whispered in her ear during her final years, that I'd taken advantage of an elderly widow's loneliness to redirect her estate. I read the complaints sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table, the same table where she taught me to do long division, the same table where she'd read me the obituaries. I read the part where Callista's attorney called me a calculating opportunist who exploited a vulnerable elder for financial gain, and I laughed, out loud, by myself. In the empty kitchen, then I called Bertram Caspian. Bertram was 73 years old. He'd been planning to retire that spring. He told me on the phone, "Holden, I am not going to retire until I have personally walked your aunt and uncle out of that courtroom in handcuffs, figuratively speaking." He hired a litigator named Marisol Quintanilla to handle the trial. She was 40-something, sharp as a knife, born and raised in Savannah. The first time I met her, she asked me 3 questions. When did I last see my mother before the funeral? Did my grandmother ever talk to me about her will? And did I have any documentation of the relationship between me and my grandmother? I answered, 9 years before the funeral. Once, briefly, and only to tell me where the document was kept. And yes, I had 22 years of birthday cards, school photos, letters, voicemails saved on an old phone, a shoebox of receipts from every Sunday breakfast we'd ever had. Marisol said, "Holden, we are going to be just fine." The hearing was set for the second week of March. By then, I had moved fully back into the Beaufort house. The coffee shop on Carteret Street kept paying rent like clockwork. The investment portfolio just sat there, untouched, accruing modest interest. I didn't spend a dime of it. It felt wrong, like I was being watched. The night before the hearing, I sat in my grandmother's front room and read through her notes one more time. She'd left me a sealed envelope in addition to the will. Bertram had given it to me the day after the funeral. He said, "She asked me to give this to you only if your aunt and uncle gave you trouble. I think now is the time." The envelope was thick. There were 3 documents inside. I read them all, twice. Then I sat there in the rocking chair for a long time, listening to the clock tick, and I cried again. Not the same kind of crying as before. This was different. This was the kind of crying you do when somebody who's already gone reaches across the empty space and shows you one more time that they had your back. I'll tell you what was in that envelope. But you have to wait, because so did Callista, so did Roderick, so did my mother. The morning of the hearing, my aunt rolled her eyes the second she saw me walk through the courthouse doors. I already told you that part. Now I'll tell you the rest. The judge was a woman named Audra Henneberry, mid-60s, white hair cropped short, reading glasses on a beaded chain. She had a reputation in the Low Country as somebody who didn't tolerate theatrics and didn't have patience for what she called estate vultures. Callista's attorney was a man named Pemberton Cleves III. I'm not making that up. He wore a 3-piece suit and a pocket watch and spoke in the slow, syrupy voice of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered to him. He gave the opening statement. He said I had moved back to Beaufort specifically to take advantage of my grandmother in her final months. He said I'd cut her off from her loving children. He said I'd pressured her, in her weakened state, to revise her estate. He said the will was the product of a young man's greed. I watched my mother's face while he was talking. She was nodding along, like she'd rehearsed it, like she believed it. Then Marisol stood up. She said, "Your Honor, my client moved back to Beaufort in February of last year to care for his grandmother through her terminal illness. The will in question was drafted in 2017, 8 years before that move, before Rosalie Mariner was sick, before she was, in counsel's words, weakened. My client did not influence the drafting of that will. He didn't even know what was in it until it was read." The judge looked at Pemberton. "Counsel, is that accurate? Was the operative will drafted in 2017? Pemberton said, "Your Honor, there were modifications. Were the modifications substantive?" "Your Honor, the yes or no, Mr. Cleves." He paused. "No, Your Honor, the Mr. Cleves." He paused. "No, Your Honor." The modifications were administrative. The judge wrote something down. It got worse for them from there. Marisol called Dr. Ashampong to the stand. Dr. Ashampong testified that my grandmother had been mentally sharp until the final week of her life. That she had specifically asked Dr. Bryce Ashampong in private whether she should be worried about her family contesting her will. That my grandmother had said, and I quote because I'll never forget it, "My grandson is the only one of them who ever showed up. The rest of them showed up for the reading." Dr. Haberseveri Ashampong testified that this conversation took place 6 months before my grandmother's death. Months before I moved back. Months before any influence could have been exerted. Pemberton tried to discredit her. He asked if she was a friend of the family. She said no, she was Rosalie's oncologist. He asked if she'd been compensated for her testimony. She said the same fee she'd charged for testifying in 2 malpractice cases the previous year, and that she'd be happy to provide the court with documentation. He sat down. Marisol called Bertram Caspian. Bertram brought the original 2017 will. He brought the notes from the meetings where it was drafted. He brought a letter in my grandmother's handwriting dated 2017 in which she wrote, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me, that she had thought long and hard about her decision and that she wanted her estate to go to the person who had loved her. not to the children who had treated her like an ATM. That last word was hers. ATM. Marisol read it aloud. The judge raised her eyebrows. Callista shifted in her seat. Then Marisol called me to the stand. She asked me about my childhood. I told the court about the porch swing, the duffel bag, the 11 months before my mother called. I told the court about the Sunday breakfasts, the baseball games, the way my grandmother sat through 3 hours of my 8th grade band concert and clapped harder than anyone in the auditorium when I finished my one-measure clarinet solo. I told the court that Callista had visited Beaufort exactly 4 times in the 22 years I lived with my grandmother. I knew because my grandmother kept a guest book. We had it in evidence. I told the court that Roderick had visited 5 times. 3 of those were for funerals of other relatives. I told the court that my mother had visited 0 times, that she had never called on my birthday, that the last conversation I'd had with her before the will was read was 9 years ago at a cousin's wedding, where she'd asked me if I could lend her $200 and then disappeared from the reception before the cake was cut. Pemberton stood up for cross-examination. He asked me if I was financially motivated. I said I was a civil engineer with a stable job and no debts. He asked me if I'd ever discussed the will with my grandmother. I said once, briefly. He asked me what was said. I said, she told me where the document was kept and who her lawyer was. She told me I'd know what to do when the time came. He asked me if I felt entitled to my grandmother's estate. I said, I don't feel entitled to anything. I feel grateful. My grandmother raised me. Everything I am because of her. Pemberton sat down. He didn't ask another question. We took a recess. When we came back, Marisol asked the judge for permission to introduce one final piece of evidence. The judge nodded. Marisol turned to me. She said, Mr. Mariner, would you read the document, please? I stood up. I walked to the witness stand. I held the envelope my grandmother had left me. I opened it. The first document was a financial accounting. Detailed, itemized. Going back 22 years. It was every check my grandmother had written to my mother, checks for rent help, medical bills, car trouble. Every check to Callista, checks for the kids' tuition, renovations, a small loan. Every check to Roderick, checks for the business, the divorce settlement, just to help out Mama. Total amount across all 3 of them, just over $612,000. I read out the total. The courtroom went very still. The second document was a letter from my grandmother, dated 3 weeks before her death. I read it out loud. To whom it may concern, if my children are reading this, it is because they have done exactly what I expected them to do, which is to challenge my will. I want the court to know that my decisions were made freely, in sound mind, and after a great deal of thought. My children received their inheritance from me over the course of 40 years, in monthly installments every time one of them called me up needing something. They never called to ask how I was. They never called to ask about my health. They called when their cars broke down and when their mortgages were late. I did not begrudge them this help. I gave it freely. But it was, in every meaningful sense, their inheritance, paid early and often. My grandson Holden has never asked me for a dime. He has only asked me to tell him stories about his grandfather and to teach him how to make biscuits. He is the only one of my descendants who knows how I take my coffee. He gets the rest. Signed, Rosalie Mariner. The judge took her glasses off. I read the third document. It was a copy of a letter my grandmother had received from my mother 7 years ago. In it, my mother asked for $40,000 to help her open a wellness retreat in Sedona. The letter included the line, and I'll never forget this either. Mama, I know you've been spending too much time with Holton. He's not your kid, he's mine. And honestly, I think it's weird how attached you've gotten. Callista made a noise, not a word. Just a noise. Pemberton was no longer making eye contact with anyone. The judge said, Thank you, Mr. Mariner. You may step down. She took a 30-minute recess. When she came back, she ruled from the bench. She said the will was valid. She said the plaintiffs had failed to demonstrate any credible evidence of undue influence. She said, and this is the part I want you to hear word for word. The evidence before this court indicates that the decedent made her wishes known clearly, repeatedly, and over a period of many years. The evidence also indicates that the plaintiffs have a documented history of treating their mother as a financial resource rather than a parent. This court will not reward that pattern by overturning a lawful and well-considered will. The petition is denied. Costs to the defendant. Costs to the defendant. That means Callista, Roderick, and my mother had to pay my legal fees. Marisol leaned over and whispered, "Holden, you won." I didn't say anything. I was looking at my mother. She was looking at the floor. She didn't look up at me. Not once. Not as the gavel came down. Not as the bailiff opened the door. Not as Pemberton gathered his papers and walked out without speaking to her. Callista was the first to leave the courtroom. She pushed past me on her way out. She didn't say a word. Roderick followed her. He paused near the door, turned, looked at me like he wanted to say something, then changed his mind and left. My mother stayed in her seat for a long time. Marisol packed up her briefcase. Bertram squeezed my shoulder. The room emptied out. Eventually, my mother stood up. She walked over to me. She didn't look at me. She said in a voice I almost didn't recognize, "Your grandmother loved you very much." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have," and then she stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. I waited. She didn't say anything else. I said, "You should have." She nodded and she walked out. I haven't seen her since. That was 14 months ago. I'm sitting on my grandmother's porch as I tell you this. Same porch swing. The pecans are dropping again. The coffee shop on Carteret Street is still paying rent. I haven't touched the investment portfolio. I'm going to donate most of it eventually to a foundation that helps grandparents raising grandchildren in the Low Country. There are more of them than you'd think. My grandmother used to volunteer with them. I kept the house. I'm going to live here. I've started a vegetable garden in the same spot she had hers. The tomatoes haven't taken yet, but the okra is doing fine. I have her rocking chair on the porch. I have her grandfather clock in the front room. I have the shoebox of receipts from every Sunday breakfast we ever had, because she kept them, all of them, for 22 years. I have her recipe for biscuits in her handwriting on an index card. I make them on Sundays now. Same way she taught me. You cut the butter in cold. You don't overwork the dough. You bake them until the tops are just barely golden. I miss her every day. If you're watching this and somebody in your life raised you when nobody else would, tell them. Don't wait. Don't assume they know. Tell them out loud in their own kitchen while they're still around to hear it. And if somebody who never showed up for you tries to walk into your life when there's something to take, let them roll their eyes. Let them whisper. Let them sue you. Bring the receipts. Tell the truth. The judge will know what to do. My grandmother did. I think about cause and effect a lot these days. Sitting on that porch, listening to the pecans drop, I have time to think about it. Callista, Roderick, and my mother didn't end up empty-handed because some cosmic force punished them. They ended up empty-handed because of 40 years of choices. Every phone call they didn't make. Every birthday they forgot. Every check they cashed without a thank you note. Those choices added up. My grandmother kept the receipts, literally. She wasn't bitter. She was just paying attention. And when the time came to decide who had earned her trust, the math had already been done. Quietly. Over decades. I learned something in that courtroom that I want to pass on, because I think a lot of people get it backwards. Doing right by someone isn't a grand gesture. It's not the eulogy you give at the funeral or the photo you post on Mother's Day. It's the Sunday breakfast you show up to when nothing dramatic is happening. It's the boring phone call you make on a Tuesday afternoon just because. My grandmother gave everything to me because for 22 years I was the one who sat across from her at that kitchen table. That wasn't strategy. I didn't know there was an estate. I just loved her. And the lesson I take from that is this. Be the person who shows up when there's nothing to gain. The people who only appear when there's something to take will always be visible eventually. The light comes for everyone in the end. I also learned something about strength. When Callista and Roderick filed that lawsuit, my first instinct was to settle. Give them something. Make it go away. I didn't want the fight. I didn't want my name in court documents. I called Bertram that night and asked him if I could just hand over a portion and be done with it. He said something I'll never forget. He said, "Holden, your grandmother didn't raise you to apologize for being loved." That stopped me, because he was right. Standing your ground isn't aggression. Sometimes it's the most respectful thing you can do for the person who fought for you. Backing down would have meant telling my grandmother posthumously that her decision was negotiable. It wasn't. And finally, I learned to keep my own house in order. Not just legally. though that matters. And if you have someone who depends on you, please, please put it in writing, but also morally. My grandmother left this world with no debts, no regrets, and a paper trail that vindicated her in a courtroom she'd never set foot in. That's the kind of legacy I want to leave too. Quiet, documented, built one Sunday at a time. If you only take one thing from what I've told you, take that. Build a kind of life where, if anyone ever questions who you really were, the evidence is already there. You won't have to defend it. The truth will defend itself.